Hello, everybody. My name is Jonah Batumzi, Blendium Project founder, and today we have Saket Soni with us joining for our reboot of Hopes and Dreams. Hopes and Dreams is a show that does exactly what it says on the tin. We speak with influential people, artists, creatives, revolutionaries from the global majority in the hopes of inspiring our communities to live unapologetically and authentically. Today we have Saket Soni with us. He is the author of The Great Escape, a book that has been talked about widely. May have seen him on NPR, New York Times, speaking about this book. Today we have him with us, and we can't wait to have this conversation. So thank you for joining us. Hello, Saket.
Hey, Jonah, how you doing?
I'm very good. And you?
I'm really glad to be here. Yeah, I'm doing well. It's a rainy day in DC, but great to be with you here.
Yes, thank you for joining us. Thank you for taking the time to write this book, The Great Escape. When I got the message to actually enter conversation with you and the team, I had never heard about The Great Escape. I had never heard about this story. I had never heard about this happening. So I found it as a person who seeks knowledge and information. I just thank you for actually bringing these people's stories to light and doing the work that you do.
That's very kind. Thanks, Jonah, and thanks for reading.
Okay, right. So everybody's wondering who doesn't know who you are. Tell us a bit about yourself, Saket. And I've heard other interviews before, and you usually start from the Chicago part. I want to know Saket before that part, when you're growing up, your youth and your background.
My youth and background. Well,
Yes.
my long ago youth was spent partly in New Delhi. I was born in India, in New Delhi, and partly in a lot of other countries. My father worked for the Foreign Service. He was posted to consulates around the world. So I spent part of my childhood in India, and then every few years would go out to other countries and then return to India. So I led a pretty nomadic childhood, and as a result, I got to I got good at moving between worlds, from India to Singapore, and then back to India, and then out to Pakistan and Jamaica, and then when I was 17, I moved to a whole new world. I came to the United States. I'm probably I came to the United States to study theater, and I think my parents are probably the only parents in the 5,000-year history of India to let their son go to the United States to study theater. That's what I was doing in Chicago. I went to the University of Chicago on a scholarship, was running around doing theater, directing plays, trying to be a playwright. And then...
Sorry, can I just say something? Sorry to interrupt you, but
yeah.
I love that you said that, because I didn't have to actually come in and say that. Like, how I'm thinking that as well too as I'm reading the book. How on earth did he get to go to university and do theater? How did you convince you? It sounds like you didn't have to convince your parents.
I did have to convince them. I mean, they were quite distraught when I announced my plans. I grew up. My parents are incredibly loving, and they've always been incredibly supportive of everything I've done. And growing up, one of the ways that my dad and I bonded was over books. He used to have this old crockery cabinet that he had kind of turned into a very deep bookshelf, and it was really dusty, and all the books were from his college days, and we'd sit there at the beginning of my summer vacations, and he'd fish books out, and I'd read those books, and we'd bond. And so that got me really into reading and writing and literature. And so one day I announced that I was going to study English literature.
Mm,
with, and they said, what on earth are you thinking? Like, how are you going to make that a life? How are you going to pay the rent? How are you going to make that lucrative? And I said, well, my plan is to make that lucrative by focusing on theater. I'm going to direct plays. And so they were quite distraught. They wanted me to do anything else, do theater over the weekends. But I think when I got the scholarship to the United States, they thought, okay, this might work. Like maybe he can get, a teaching job at a college or something. I think
mm,
that calmed them down a little bit.
yeah. And how did all of that? You talked about your uh, kind of upbringing being quite nomadic, and for me, I take from that automatically you're coming in and out of cultures. You're in a culture that's normal to you, and then going to a slightly different one, and kind of learning how to mold yourself and flex yourself to be able to exist in these different worlds. How did your upbringing kind of bring you to the work that you do today?
Well, I think what I learned was that you know sometimes you get to a place and you're the stranger, and you wonder if you'll ever fit in, and you wonder if you'll make friends. It's scary being the stranger, you
Mm,
know. Um, except when you step back and you realize that we're all strangers in some way or the other, you know. And those two people who have a deep, long relationship, um, you know, well, they might have one day been strangers to each other, you know.
mm,
So moving to new places every 2 or 3 years, setting down new routes, having to make new friends. Um, I think I learned that people are actually a lot more welcoming than we give them credit for. And
mm,
all you have to do sometimes is step in and start the conversation and try. It doesn't have to be as hard for strangers as we think it does. People are, uh, you know, uh, people people tend to like new friends, even if they won't admit it to you. And that's sort of been a practice of mine. I think that a lot of what I do now is helping strangers not feel
mm.
like strangers, helping immigrant workers not feel like strangers, building bonds between people who were born outside the United States and just moved here, with people who have never left the United States, finding a basis for those friendships and bonds. That's really what you're doing as an organizer. I mean, it sounds fancy. You're a labor organizer and you're fighting the system and trying to raise wages. But at the core of it, there's just human beings who have to find connection, and having built connection, use that connection powerfully to change the world. It all has a basis in friendship, and I got to kind of um, moving around and being a stranger so much um, got me to enjoy moving between worlds and realizing that friendships can be built wherever you go.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. And just tell you a quick story. I studied abroad, and that studying abroad in Dublin
Uh-huh.
made me want to travel in Western Europe. So I backpacked in Western Europe. I saved up for a year, traveled for 3 months, and traveling alone was a great experience because you meet as many people almost as that you want to meet, that you extend yourself to, that you see at the bar or in the restaurant and decide to speak to. If you want to be by yourself, you very well can be by yourself. But if you
Mhm.
want to meet people and have a great time, you need to extend yourself to that contact with people.
So
So
true. Yeah, that's so true. It's a good metaphor. I think of my childhood as one big backpack trip.
yeah,
It
yeah,
resonates. Yeah.
yeah. So you mentioned labor organizer. There's also human rights strategist. Now, a lot of people, when they see that word organizer, we know what it is to organize our cabinet or our fridge. How do you describe being an organizer? How do you describe it to a little kid or a young kid if you had to?
Well, organizing is it's just the process of getting together with people, with other people, because something you want is important enough, big enough, that you can't get it yourself. You know, you you want to buy something from the grocery store, you can go yourself, right? You can drive out, to get where you want, um, most days, right? Um, but the the way that people have changed their conditions, whether it's um, women who until recently couldn't vote, in many countries, and fought for the right to vote, or whether it's workers on a factory floor wanting a better wage, or abolitionists in the United States or elsewhere, Britain and elsewhere, wanting to bring an end to the system of enslavement, systems of enslavement. I mean, these large scale changes are just not they're not possible, um, as a result of individuals.
Mm,
We can't do that ourselves. First thing, and there's a lot of people right now. You look at these big problems: climate change and inflation and abuse of immigrants, anti-blackness in the world. Um, these are huge systemic problems, and a lot of times, um, you know, people get demoralized and they think, what can I do as an individual? What can I do alone? There's nothing I can do alone. Well, the answer to that is you can do something as an individual, which is you stop being an individual, stop being alone, go join up with 3 or 4 other people, and then join a bigger group and a bigger group until you're part of a force, you know, that that's that's trying to change something, trying to change your school district, trying to change your neighborhood, or trying to change the country by protesting or voting.
mm,
All of those processes of joining up with other people is called organizing. The way I ask you a question to find out, what you care about, and whether it's the same thing that I care about, and can we walk together? Can we fight together to change it? That's organizing. It's done. It's done in many ways. It's been done throughout time, and it's simple and it works, but it just takes time.
sure. Thank you for that. What type of situations do you find yourself in on a daily basis then, as an organizer?
What kinds of situations? Well, organizing is about solving problems. So as a labor organizer, you're trying to solve the problems of workers. I work with a lot of immigrant workers who rebuild homes and schools and cities after hurricanes, floods, and fires. And so every day, I am trying to solve the problems of those workers, getting them paid if they're not paid, getting them um, care if they're injured. In fact, my book, The Great Escape, starts with a scene of me trying to solve a very particular kind of problem, a really thorny problem. It starts with a scene on my birthday in New Orleans, where I'm sitting in an unheated car with my coworker, and I'm trying to help a Honduran day laborer ransom his kidnapped nephew. This is a worker who approached me. He said, "My nephew's been kidnapped by coyotes. Can you help me?" We got together with him. We tried to solve that problem, and the book opens with this scene late at night on an unlit street in New Orleans, a street that's still torn up after the hurricane of the previous year, and we're trying to get his nephew back. That's an example of a very extreme kind of problem that I would try to solve.
Sure, sure. Now you've mentioned, so let's talk a bit about the book, right? So in the book, it gets to a part that's revolving around a situation that has come as a result of Hurricane Katrina. So I'm conscious of the fact I'm based outside of London. You're in DC. There are going to be people who are watching this stream from different parts of the world. Could you set the scene for what that was like in New Orleans and that part of the world in general?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, Hurricane Katrina was a pretty world-changing event for people living in the United States. Um, it was the year was 2005, and although there had been, hurricanes before that, this was an extraordinary one. There was in August 2005 a very large hurricane that made landfall in Mississippi, about 4 or 5 hours away from New Orleans. And that would have been destruction enough. But then what happened was that the levees, these walls that surround New Orleans and are supposed to, protect New Orleans, levees similar to the ones you have in Europe, in Scandinavian countries that protect those countries from water, from flooding. The levees in New Orleans, surrounding New Orleans, broke, and as a result, the city was flooded. And this flooding, was followed by a catastrophic negligence by the federal government. So what you had was around the country, we were watching. I was sitting in Chicago and watching people on rooftops, crawling from their attics. The floodwater would rise up to the attics, and then people would crawl from the attics to the rooftops, and they were waiting to be rescued by a U.S. government that didn't come. Now, most of those dead, displaced, and most of those waiting to be rescued were African American. The flooding, obviously, the hurricane is a natural event, but Katrina really unmasked how those kinds of catastrophes have a real racial impact. That the people who were predetermined to be the worst affected, to be killed, displaced, lose their home, lose their land, lose their income as a result of the hurricane, were largely African American, and largely in New Orleans were the people who were also at the center of the economy, the culture, the food, the music.
Yes.
Everybody who drove, everybody who made New Orleans, right, was all of a sudden up on their rooftops waiting to be rescued by a government that many said seemingly didn't care. And that launched, an extraordinary social movement in the United States. People were outraged. And, a lot of people, this was the Bush era. This was George W. Bush was president. And it was really, this was part of the social movement that really grew from there and wound up, with the election of President Barack Obama. So it was one of those really altering, history making events in the country. And I wound up, like many people, I wound up watching TV in Chicago. I was a young community organizer, and the thing is that in Chicago, which is far away from New Orleans, New Orleans is down in the South, Chicago's in the Midwest, very far away, a place I'd never been. But I wound up connecting to it because my job as an organizer was to knock on doors in poor neighborhoods in Chicago to help renters get a better deal with their rent. I was organizing renters. And a lot of those people were older African Americans who had their roots in the South. A lot of people had migrated from the South
The Great Migration, to the
Great Migration.
Yes.
Yeah, and the way they were watching the events of post-Katrina New Orleans, they weren't surprised. That there was a large scale surprise. I mean, the liberal media and others were saying, how could this happen in America? And instead, these older Black folks were saying, who I was watching TV with, would say, of course this is going to happen in America. What else is going to happen? And they were accessing a deeper history. And so I just thought I had to go. I went to New Orleans to volunteer initially as a relief worker, but I ended up staying 16 years and moving my life there to be part of how the city and the region got rebuilt.
Sure. And so in the book, then we learn about how this catastrophic event then creates this economy almost for essentially, I don't want to say cheap labor, but let's just say for lower cost labor than they would normally be bringing in. And out of the blue, one day you receive a call from a gentleman, and I'm sure you receive a lot of calls like this from people that you don't know, but this gentleman has an Indian accent. I just want to know what was going through your head when you received that call that day.
Yeah, the story starts with this mysterious midnight phone call that I got. And what was strange about it was exactly what you said. This is a man with, not only with an Indian accent, but speaking to me in Hindi, relieved that he had someone to talk to. He had obviously just arrived all the way from India, just arrived into the part of Mississippi that was devastated by Hurricane Katrina. I was used to getting calls from workers. People would call who were mostly U.S. born, Black or white, or if they weren't, people would call, immigrant workers would call who were Latin American workers, from Honduras and Mexico and many, many other countries, Mexico, South and Central America. And they were either living in the U.S., they'd come in from Houston to help rebuild. The post-Katrina flooding had turned the Gulf Coast into the world's largest construction site. And all of this rebuilding was being done by immigrant workers. But this was a man from India. And I wondered, how on earth did a man newly arrived from India find himself in the Mississippi Gulf Coast? It turned out he was one of 500 Indian men who were brought from India to rebuild oil rigs in the Mississippi Gulf Coast. Recruiters for a big oil rig company, a big shipyard, had gone to India. They had recruited these men, promised them green cards and good jobs if they would come to work for this company. The picture you see is a kind of aerial view, helicopter's eye view picture of this huge, sprawling, half a football stadium size dock that they had. It was a maze of interconnected factories and metal workshops where these men arrived to build large oil rigs for this company. Now, recruiters made them incredible promises. They promised them the American dream, the chance to get a green card, which is what you need to move permanently to the United States. They offered these men the chance to come and live in the United States and be joined by their families in 9 months. And the catch was that the men would have to pay enormous sums of money for the opportunity. They paid $20,000 a piece. This was, the equivalent of $500,000 for them. More money than they had, more money than anybody had in their family. So they sold ancestral land. They sold their wives' jewelry. They sold their own homes. They put homes on the hawk. They took high interest loans from moneylenders. And they came and they found themselves in an American nightmare. It turned out that All the promises were false. There were no green cards. The men found themselves on temporary visas, living in a labor camp, 24 people to a room, working round-the-clock shifts behind a barbed wire fence, and to live in these conditions that you see, they were charged $1,000 a month in rent. That's where they found themselves.
Which was a slap in the face. I think so. Things that I find really interesting from that is that I would have still been in the States, there's no thought or concept. I think. I mean, obviously, I was in the Midwest, but there's no thought or concept that, hey, this has happened. Do I know who is actually doing the work to fix this and try to rebuild the city? There's no thought, or I think even visibility from where I was sat at, to know these were the types of people who were being brought over to help rebuild the country. One thing I have to say about the book and the way that it starts is, you see the title, you see what it's about, but I love the way that you humanized these men's stories, and you wouldn't even know that it was about them being trafficked over to the country. You could think you're wrapped up in a love story, in a South Asian or Indian love story, and someone's being pressured to get married, and no, he doesn't want to take the shadi on and all of this other stuff, and he likes somebody else, and it's a love marriage. How dare he? Right. And so I just love the fact that you humanize them, and that's how the book almost opens up, hearing and reading these different stories about the struggles that these people went through to effectively raise this money.
Yeah, I'm so glad. I'm so glad you said that. I wanted to write this as part, political conspiracy thriller, part love story, because that's what that's what
I could tell. I could tell.
So that was a choice. I mean, it also helped that these men who are at the center of the book are just such beautiful characters, and they were 20 something at the start of this book. So what do you care about when you're 20 something? There's a character named Ebi Raju who's right at the heart of the book. He's one of the protagonists, and before he's trafficked to the United States, his biggest problem is his mom is trying to get him married. And he doesn't want to be married. He wants to date. He wants to be a 20-year-old. He wants to have a life, and he wants to go back to being a migrant worker. He's been away from India for 5 years. He worked in Bahrain. He came back, and he saw the things that his parents would never tell him on the phone. He saw that his father couldn't afford to retire. He saw that in the Indian economy of the time, his family was sinking, and he needed to get back out there, make more money as a migrant worker, and help his family. Meanwhile, his mother has put an ad in the paper about him in the matrimonial section of the paper. She's trying to get him married, and he's like, well, I don't want to get married, and we can't afford a wedding. But then something happens. He accidentally winds up on the phone with the woman his mother has chosen as his bride to be, the bride to be in his mother's dream arranged marriage for her son. He winds up on the phone with her, and when he hears her voice, he falls in love with her. Now he has a new problem. By then, he's taken the loan, he's sold the house, he's bought the American Recruiter's story, and he's ready to go to America. Now he has to tell his bride-to-be that he's going to leave for America 2 days after the wedding. So now he has a big new problem. And so, this woman who's now his wife, Binsi is Ebi's wife, they go to the airport. Ebi leaves for America. Binsi believes that she's going to join him in 9 months. Not only that, but by this point, Binsi's pregnant with his child. Well, it turns out the promises were false, and Binsi doesn't end up seeing him again for another 3 years. Ebi will not meet the son that was born to them until that child is 3 years old. And that story of love and separation is really, those are the stories at the heart of the book. I mean, every immigration story is a love story, by definition, by necessity. And I tried to approach these immigrant stories as love stories.
Thank you for that. So one thing I'm thinking about, and we've even seen it recently when the recent World Cup, and I think this is another thing that a lot of people don't think about, is the amount of let's say South Asian or Indian people who end up doing similar work like this in places like the Middle East, right? So we saw this in the World Cup, and this happened, obviously, Hurricane Katrina. What do you think this has to say in general for these kind of capitalistic societies that we live within?
Well, India has over 1 billion people, right? South Asia is an extraordinary subcontinent. And young people like Ebi, Ebi was 25 at the time that he saw the American ad in the paper, and wanted to go to America. I mean, these are people who cannot make ends meet in India. They can't fulfill their dreams in India. There's not enough money. Prices are too high. Jobs pay too little, and families need food on the table. So what workers like Ebi decide to do is to become migrant workers, to leave the families they love in order to provide for them. That's what it is to be a migrant worker. You as Ebi once put it to me, you leave the ones you love to help them live. You leave your family behind, and you just want to get to a recruiter or somebody who's going to throw you like a dart at the global economy, and you hope you reach a country where you can wire money home and help your family live. That's the pursuit of the migrant worker. Now, given that, companies around the world for many, many decades, industries around the world, the oil industry, the shipbuilding industry, industries around the world have taken advantage of this, and they've used South Asia as a place to get cheap labor, as a place to draw in labor. The way Dubai turned from a desert to a city was through South Asian labor. It was South Asian migrant workers, not only from India. It was also Sri Lankans and Bangladeshis, many others who came and built. So we're not just talking about a little bit of, building a house, right? We're talking about building extraordinary oil refineries, or oil rigs in the ocean that look like palaces, in the water, like enormous, city-like structures. And then recently you have the same thing with the World Cup, right? All these stadiums built again by South Asian migrant workers. I think what it speaks to is the need for, if work needs to be done, then workers need to be welcome, and they need to be safe and paid well. They need to be able to return to their families. People are not against doing the work, but on what terms?
Yes.
Is the question for all of us, and what kind of moral human society extracts work in a way that leaves workers who are already migrants, which is bad enough, falling to their deaths instead of keeping them safe and well paid and thanked, after the work is done.
Sure. And right. So later on in the book, we come into this point where we learn about your own struggle. Sorry, not this part here. But we come to this part later on in the book where you come into your own struggle of, not being legally documented, within the country. Again, I thank you for sharing your story as well too, because oftentimes we're led to believe that people who are undocumented, they look a certain way or they come from a certain place. And just hearing a bit about your story was just a different perspective that I think was great to input to this kind of wider conversation that hopefully this will start.
Yeah, there was a picture you had up of me in a jacket and tie.
Yes.
That was the 26 or 27-year-old version of myself,
Yes.
and I think that jacket was probably either borrowed or stolen. Um, the tie was deep inside a duffel bag I had from
Yeah.
my theater days.
Yeah.
That was
You
probably
had somebody else tie it for you, right?
I to this day don't know how to tie a tie, but I had to win the trust of these workers, and so the book was interesting to write. I wasn't initially going to be a character in the book. Then I realized that I had to help readers navigate these worlds, worlds that I knew that you maybe don't know, right?
Mm.
A Mississippi labor camp, right? The Mississippi labor camp that the workers were trapped in, or New Orleans after Katrina. These were worlds I knew. I lived and breathed in these worlds. And in a book, you need a guide, to walk you through. You need a tour guide. So I had to be that. But then there was a new problem. If I was going to be in the book, I had to be an interesting character, not only that, but I was sharing these deep personal stories of the workers, their love stories, their complexity. I was sharing about their difficulties in their marriages, their love stories. I was sharing how they were on their bad days, because that's what makes characters interesting. We don't want to read about saints versus sinners or perfect immigrants, because those don't exist. We want to read about complex human beings, with emotional conflicts and difficulties, people who are trying to be better but aren't always their best selves, right? And so I realized that I had to sort of treat my own character that way. So I don't know about you, Jonah, but I think you and I are now the most perfect, fully self-actualized versions of ourselves, right? But it wasn't the case when we were in our 20s. In my when I was 28 at the beginning of this book, I did not have my act together. My life was a mess. I was living in New Orleans, running this small little nonprofit, but I was estranged from home. I was carrying a lot of guilt for not sending money home. I wasn't calling my mother. She would call me and I would send her to voicemail. I wouldn't call her back for months.
I think we've all done that.
a lot of conflicted feelings and immigrant guilt and difficulty. And at the center of it, I suddenly had this new thing, which is that these 500 men from India were in the middle of my life. The last people I was basically an American in all but passport, and and I was so estranged from India that the last people I expected to drop into the middle of my life were 500 men from India, and they were. And suddenly I needed them to trust me. So they were happy. They wanted a U.S. attorney carrying a briefcase and a jacket. I didn't have a jacket that fit me. I didn't know how to tie a tie. I was trying to get them to trust me, so I couldn't actually admit my vulnerabilities at the time. But they were there, and in the middle of it was my own immigration status, which was vulnerable. I had been undocumented when I was in Chicago, running around doing theater. I had missed an immigration deadline. And I slipped out of status. I didn't think it was that serious, but then 9/11 happened, which really changed the lives of lots of immigrants in the United States. That tragedy became the pretext for a lot of anti-immigrant policy and practice. I was suddenly being attacked in trains and in elevators, in buildings. I lost my normalcy and my foothold in normal American life, and I was just sort of dealing with all of that. My immigration story and the love story, my own love story, that's kind of at the center of it. I don't know spoilers, but that's at the center of the book, and I just decided that as an author, I had to tell that story, both to make an interesting character out of myself, but also to kind of fulfill a moral kind of kind of obligation to these other men, because I was putting their hearts like right out there. I was putting their stories right out there, and
Sure.
I had to add mine as well.
Sure. No, but thank you for that. I mean, even you just saying, I mean, obviously you would have came over on some type of student visa, something like that, and then it expired, right? I think that people often, undocumented means that you swam through a river and then crossed over a border somewhere. People have that thought in their head. And, I think that it's important that we know that they're all different types of people doing different types of things that for some reason or another, sometimes fall into the
Yeah,
status of being undocumented.
that's a really good point. In fact, South Asians are a large share of the undocumented people in the United States. Indians are among the fastest growing undocumented population in the United States. And among South Asians, just like among Latin Americans, there are lots of mixed families.
Mm.
An undocumented child, I'm sorry, a documented child driving his dad to work who's undocumented. And so the dad can't have a driver's license, right? Or a documented daughter, trying to access the healthcare system, navigate, the American system for her undocumented parents. All of this exists in the South Asian community in the U.S. And it's really important, like you're saying, it's important to tell these stories, stories that we're sometimes too ashamed to tell. But it's important to tell these stories about the community.
Sure. So as we're getting to the end here, so one thing that I found really interesting, the people who initially kind of put me in contact with your story and with the book, I think they knew that I'd like it for a certain reason. But at the Blendium Project, one thing that we strive for and work towards is, I call it kind of Black and Brown solidarity, which can mean a lot of different things depending on where you're at in the world. Black and South Asian solidarity, we can call it that as well too. There was, as we move on through the book, I can see you really trying to make a connection. And you mentioned a person by the name of Ted Quant,
Yeah.
is it? Who's a friend and a mentor, but somebody who was very pivotal, even though he doesn't show up often in the book, to get the workers on site. Talk a bit about Ted and your relationship.
Well, Ted was a mentor of mine when I got to New Orleans. He took me under his wing. He had been an African-American labor organizer and teacher to many, mentor to many. And he really taught me, along with many other people, he really taught me what it means to be an organizer in the American South, and particularly how to bring African-American organizing history to bear. So when the men engineered their escape from the labor camp, Ted became a mentor to all of them. And what he and other Black organizers taught the men, these were people who had newly arrived from India. They had more faith in the American system than most people born in the United States.
Sure.
They thought, well, all we have to do is get to Washington, D.C., and we'll just get what we deserve from the government. It took Ted and others to complicate that and explain to the men that, many people in history have fought to get what they deserve in America, people of color, Black people, and other people in the United States. And this is really a longer fight and a harder fight than you think. And it became the basis not only of learning, but of deep friendships, just like I had with Ted, deep friendships between the men in the book from India and their African American neighbors, the people who they were in the midst of, friendships that still remain and that are treasured. And I think that's really the basis of change, is building bonds with people who don't look like you, and particularly if you're fighting for justice, building bonds with communities who have been at it much longer than you have, so you can learn from them.
And was it difficult for, so this is my perspective from somebody who's traveled to India several times. Was it difficult to try to make the connection between the Indian men who had probably never interacted or engaged with African American or people of African descent before, to then now be trusting these people that you're bringing to them and trying to share their stories?
It took a lot of discussion and education. I think that there are many parallels in India that I was able to draw from. Many of these men were from lower castes in India, and had histories in their own hometowns, where it took relationships to make change, right? At the end of the day, though, I think that, these men, they were trapped in a labor camp, and they engineered an escape. And when they were out, they knew they needed help. What I did intentionally was put them in relationship with the kind of help they didn't know they needed. They didn't know that they needed the help of people who had been on strike before, and I put them in relationship with organizers who were part of the the Memphis sanitation workers strike, which made change for workers. So those signs, "I am a man" and "dignity," came from those pictures of those strikes. I think that it takes friendships to change your mind, and the first thing I set out to do was build real friendships between these Indian men once they were out of the labor camp, and African American organizers, and those friendships, I think, changed their mind.
Thank you for that. And as we get to the end here, what was it about the Southern labor organizing that you thought was important? You also make reference to having them understand that was part of their journey to, I guess, kind of believing that they could escape and be free as well too. But what was it about the Southern labor organizing that you wanted to draw from?
Well, these men were not the first who found themselves in a labor camp by the Mississippi River. They were not the first to be trapped and not allowed to escape in a camp on company property in the American South. The idea of bringing over cheap or free labor and then controlling that labor, not allowing it to run away, and in fact running after it to catch people if they run away, all of which happened to these workers. Well, that idea is about as old as America. It's American slavery. It's the indentured servitude system that came afterwards. It's what happened during Jim Crow and after. And I needed these men to understand the history they were stepping into, if they wanted to change it, and have a different outcome for themselves. I think that was at the heart of it.
Thank you for that. Okay, we're at the end. We're almost at the end here, but while I was reading this book, I was like, this has to be a movie. This has to turn into a movie. So, who plays you in the movie?
That's a very funny question. You're kind for asking. I haven't given that much thought, but I'll tell you one thing. All the Indian men who are at the heart of the book, the Ebi Raju, the newlywed guy, and the Hemant, the young lover in New Delhi who wants a love marriage and is trying to pursue his girlfriend's dad to get him to agree with it. All of these characters made up their minds long ago about who would play them in the movie, and I think that they all have their own great ideas, their own casts. They're really thrilled. they ask me the same question. And actually, we I don't know if you've seen this Indian this like, blockbuster Indian movie called RRR.
I haven't seen that yet, no. But I've heard my
It's
mother-in-law, but my wife's actually Telugu, so
oh,
they won't let me not hear about that.
oh, I can't believe you haven't watched it in that case. Well,
Yeah.
there's Telugu speaking workers who are part of this campaign and who are in the book, who see themselves who see themselves as the heart of the movie version, even if they were on the minor characters in the book. And they've picked those two actors to play them. One of those two actors that played that were at the heart of RRR.
Gotcha. Okay. Look, the way that we always close this hopes and dreams is asking people such as yourself or the people we're interviewing, what are your hopes and dreams for the future? So I would like to pose that question to you as we close out here.
Well, my hope for the future, my dream for the future is that we live in a world where migrants are welcome and strangers are celebrated. We're all going to become migrants at some point. We move from place to place. Our lives are made of arrivals and departures. And I hope for a world where all of it, all the courage it takes to move, all the courage it takes to be a migrant or an immigrant is celebrated. I also hope for a world that, as a result, the kinds of bonds that you're trying to build between different communities, are stronger and part of the majority culture, not something we have to bring into the mainstream, but that is really a deep part of how we live our lives in the mainstream.
Thank you for that. Let me just try to give anybody here in the audience an opportunity to ask anything or pose anything. I think we have a question that was, what was something interesting that you have learned or gathered from this conversation? If everybody would like to insert that into the chat, would love to learn or would love to know about one thing that you learned from this conversation today. And thank you for joining us wherever you've joined throughout the world. Do we have any takers here? I don't think we do. But Saket, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonah. Thanks for having me on.
I want to applaud you and celebrate you, and thank you for bringing these people's stories to the world, bringing this topic to the world, and just all of the great things that you're doing to try to make the world a better place. So thank you for being another spoke in the wheel, shall they say, to try to make this place a better place for us all.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.